Hello, I am Father Travis Stevens. I'll be the instructor for this class. It is Theology 480. It's a special topic in the theology of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. The first three classes that we have for this course will be online. There'll be two Yuja classes. This is the first of those two, and then there'll be a YouTube video on the Gulag Archipelago that I would like you to watch for the second class. And then I'll do the third class as a recording. I'll be back in person the second week. Unfortunately, I'm going to be out of the country the first week and a half of studies. So our first couple classes will be not in person, unfortunately. In this class, I want to introduce this course, and then I want to, which will involve going through the syllabus. And then I want to look at the readings that have been assigned for the first class. Okay, by way of introduction, this class is titled The Theology of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a Theology for Suffering, or for Sufferers. So my interest in Solzhenitsyn is sparked by general interest in Russian literature. I first began to have an interest in Russian literature reading Dostoevsky. This moved me to teach a class on Dostoevsky last year, which I thought was very enjoyable for me, and some of the students who took the class last year are taking this course this year, so I think they would say that it was an enjoyable class as well. This course will follow a pattern that's similar to that course, which is to say that we're going to be reading primary sources and then discussing the topics in a seminar-like fashion. So the expectation of participation is actually quite heavy. In fact, it's reflected in the grade for the class itself, participation. So participation is not just being present, but actually actively being present and participating, which means speaking, asking questions, and offering commentary. It will necessitate doing the readings before class. And this is kind of a good preparation for students who may be considering graduate level studies in the future, because this is largely the nature of graduate courses, particularly graduate courses in theology or other liberal arts. So let's look at the syllabus to begin with. First of all, we're going to be meeting in Clare Hall 140 from 3:30 to 4:45 p.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Of course, as I said, attendance is expected and very important. It makes up 20% of the grade, at least. And I say at least because I'm not sure 100% how we're going to do the assessment regarding the possibility of having presentation / a paper. The text, there's quite a few texts required for the class. The first listed in the syllabus is the biography written by Joseph Pierce from Ignatius Press. I have it assigned throughout. It's a great text in terms of offering insights into Solzhenitsyn. Joseph Pierce, when he wrote this text, as you can see in the preface, met with Solzhenitsyn himself and got to know him personally and actually get some information from him directly. The first sets of books that we're going to be reading from are the Gulag Archipelago itself. So that's in 3 volumes. They're fairly cheap. They're not expensive. The 3 volumes of the Gulag Archipelago. We're not going to read them in its entirety, because if we were to do that, that would literally have to constitute an entire class in itself. There is another text, compilation, or a short, abbreviated, abridged version of the Gulag Archipelago with an intro by Jordan Peterson. This is nice, but it didn't have all the readings that I wanted for my purpose. So I decided when formulating this course not to use this abbreviated version, but to go ahead and have you purchase all 3 volumes, and I will select the readings from these 3 volumes that we will read from. After we delve into the Gulag Archipelago, we're going to look at another book, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. This is really the first famous book that Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote on the Gulag. So we'll talk a little bit more when we get into our discussion about what that is, but it's very formative for his life and for his writing. Then after reading the Gulag Archipelago, A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, we're going to delve into the Cancer Ward, which is another book that Solzhenitsyn wrote while he was still somewhat in the good graces of the Soviet Union. And then finally, we'll end this course by reading In the First Circle. In the First Circle is a book that he also wrote still while he was living in the Soviet Union. Cancer Word, In the First Circle, and A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich are all fictional. These books were written before Alexander Solzhenitsyn received the Nobel Prize. We might say that it's these texts in particular that were used to assess his reception of and winning of the Nobel Prize in literature in 1970. After receiving the Nobel Prize, Solzhenitsyn completed the Gulag Archipelago. In fact, he had really largely completed the Gulag Archipelago in the late 60s, but it was not published until the 1970s, until 1974, after he had received the Nobel Prize. Anyway, we'll talk a little bit about his biography. Actually, we're going to spend a significant amount of the whole entire course delving into his biography and the impact that that has on his writings. But, okay, why a class? Well, let's continue looking, at the syllabus. I have a number of further readings, and these readings, obviously, I do not expect that anybody necessarily go out and buy these readings, but if this is a subject that interests you, then these are texts that you might consider for further research. I have had a chance to read virtually all of these texts as well. And the advantage of many of these texts is that they give us context. So they enable us to go more deeply into what was going on at the time of the life of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. There's one book that I would recommend that is a great summation. It's less than 200 pages. I would recommend Richard Pipe's Communism, A History. That's one book that I would recommend. If you read that, it's excellent. Gives us a really good context. If there was a second book that I would recommend, it would be Gulag, A History by Anne Applebaum. She received the Pulitzer Prize for that particular book. So I do recommend that book as well if I were to recommend one or two of these further reading texts. And they could be helpful for any paper/presentation that you may do for the course going forward. As I said before, I'm not sure if we will do a presentation. I think it would be nice to have students do a presentation. And likely what that might look like is either a presentation on one's paper topic or perhaps a presentation on the readings for that particular day. And it just kind of gives you as a student an opportunity to practice teaching. It also gives you the opportunity to delve more deeply into a particular topic, and it gives us a broader number of things for the assessment for the grade in the course. Let's see. I think really when I presented the text, I largely went through the course schedule as well. Okay. I hope that it's not too overwhelming for you, or you don't see it as too overwhelming. One of the best ways, this is not a heavy philosophy class. So it may seem like there's a lot of assigned reading, but it's not heavy philosophy reading. So it should be somewhat enjoyable. And there's really not a lot, with the exception of Pierce, there's not a lot of assigned secondary sources either for the class. So really in this course, our goal is to delve deeply into the primary sources and to get into the heart and the life of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. All right, let's look now, and I'm going to use this chance, looking at this first reading, to consider why we might be interested in Solzhenitsyn at all. Okay, so I'm a Catholic priest myself, a Roman Catholic priest in the Western Church, and why is it that I would be interested in teaching a class on a literary figure in the East, a 20th century literary figure? Well, part of the answer has to do with this question of suffering. Dostoevsky, Solzhenitsyn, many of the Russian literary figures love to engage with and ask deep questions about the meaning of suffering in their life. And Solzhenitsyn is a remarkable figure because he is a man of his time. He was born, he calls himself a son of the revolution because he was born in the same year, within a year of the Russian Revolution. He was born in 1918, within a year of the Russian Revolution. And as a child of the revolution, he was raised by his mother. His father died in a hunting accident while his mother was pregnant with him. And his mother was educated, well educated. They came from a relatively well-to-do family. She was educated within the Russian system. And what we have to understand at the turn of the 20th century, turn of the 19th and 20th century, is that there's a class of people known as intelligentsia. One of the things that the Russian monarchy wanted to do at that time was to encourage people to become educated. And so this opened the door for the possibility of people to become educated, particularly in liberal arts, in politics, and philosophy. Unfortunately, a consequence of that is that they ended up biting the hand that fed them, because many of the liberal philosophies followed the liberal philosophy and leanings in the West, Marx in particular. And so Solzhenitsyn's mother was educated in this vein of thought, as we can see from Pierce's text. And so she was somewhat anti-Christian, or had fallen away from her Christian faith, seeing it as superstitious, until her husband died. When her husband died, the experience of suffering led her back to her faith. And when Solzhenitsyn was born, he was raised in a very religious family by his mother. But at the same time, much like his mother, he also went to school and was raised in the historical context of the Russian Revolution. And so the education that he received was very much anti-religion, atheistic. dialectical materialism. And we'll talk a little bit more about each of these concepts throughout the class. Suffice it to say, Solzhenitsyn was put into a position where he had to literally choose between being a Christian, which involved lots of sacrifice that he saw demonstrated by his own family. His grandfather, for example, was persecuted by the government and the Cheka with the belief that he had gold and was hiding gold, even persecuted ultimately to the point of being driven near mad and dying. Solzhenitsyn had to choose between following the liberal, atheistic, Russian Revolution politics of the Bolsheviks versus the Christian faith of his family. And at a relatively young age of 12, he chose to follow the path of the Bolsheviks and embraced Marxism. And all of this seemed to really work out well for him. He was a brilliant student, very successful in his education, in school. He studied not literature, like you might expect of a Nobel Prize recipient, but mathematics and physics in his undergraduate. Through correspondence with a school in Moscow, he did, however, study philosophy, which we would expect of a brilliant literary author. And Solzhenitsyn studied this via correspondence, so he was literally working diligently to get 2 degrees at the same time. He was married in April of 1940 to his first wife, and not long after World War II breaks out. And Solzhenitsyn, unfortunately, at first was not eligible for the draft because of health issues, really not that serious of a health issue. He had a problem with his stomach, I can't remember, hernia issue, congenital hernia issue that prevented him from being able to join the military right away at the very outset of the war. But he was able to join eventually, and he became ultimately a captain in the artillery services, and it was actually very successful in World War II. At the end of the war, he wrote a letter. He had been writing correspondence with a friend of his that he had grown up with, and the two of them, as Solzhenitsyn says, looking back on it, foolishly spoke very critically of Stalin. And it was clear to see, even though they used veiled language, it was clear to see that he was critical of Stalin. He was arrested, and he talks about this experience of being arrested and being interrogated and going through the entire prison system, and then ultimately eventually receiving a conviction and being sent to the Gulag himself. And this became, for himself, a point of reflection in his life. Where is he going with his life? What's the meaning of his life? Through the encounter that he has with people he meets in prison, he starts to think more about the depth of his own Christian faith and tradition. His mother had recently passed away before his arrest. And ultimately, during his time in prison, he experiences a spiritual renewal and a spiritual conversion or reversion back to his Christian roots and his Christian faith. What's remarkable about this is that we see a man who transforms and becomes a Christian in the context of great suffering. And he really struggles with this suffering. And why I call this course a theology for sufferers is because, on the one hand, what's remarkable about Alexander Solzhenitsyn is that he embraces at first all of the philosophical ideologies of the world: atheism, Marxism, communism. And through his experience of suffering in the prison system, in the Gulag system, he begins to realize that all of these things are a facade and that they're fake and they're empty and lack meaning and significance. He then goes on to discover within his Christian faith meaning in this suffering. So the whole course is going to be a reflection on this experience of Solzhenitsyn going through suffering and experiencing this conversion. And what we have is a beautiful account in the Gulag Archipelago. He never saw it as his goal to write this remarkable testament to the Gulag system, but he felt that because so many of these people had been silenced and had not had the opportunity to voice their experience, it was his duty to write this text. Solzhenitsyn was arrested in 1945 before the end of the war. He was convicted. He was sent to prison. He spent some time in a regular work camp, a regular Gulag system, but because of his familiarity with physics and mathematics, he was sent to what is called a sharashka. A sharashka is a research facility for prisoners, zeks, to do research while they work through their time in prison. It's less of a difficult experience than being in the regular work camps of the Gulag system, but it's still a prison-like experience. So this text in the first circle is largely based on Solzhenitsyn's experience in the Sharashka, the Marfino Sharashka, that is just outside of Moscow. And that's really what I would say. Is it his magnum opus? Before Dostoevsky is exiled from the Soviet Union, his fictional text, his magnum opus as a fictional text, is in the first circle. Yes. But again, the first book that Solzhenitsyn writes is One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. It's a very short read, only about 180 pages, short pages, not very deep. Not very lengthy, very short. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich is a text that Solzhenitsyn wrote after getting out of the Gulag, and he is rehabilitated. His text that he writes, he shares with a number of high, upper-ranking communists of the Politburo. They share it ultimately with Khrushchev, who sees this as an opportunity to highlight the horrors of the Gulag system under Stalin. Because after Stalin's demise and Khrushchev takes over in the Soviet Union, there is a period of de-Stalinization. And part of this de-Stalinization is to point out the evils of the Gulag system. So he actually, when he writes One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, he receives support from the Politburo to actually have this document published, and he receives great praise. People write him many letters. I think Solzhenitsyn, for at least some degree, believes that this system has passed, but unfortunately he finds out through letters of people who are still in the Gulag system that it indeed has not. It's not only a time that once was, but it's a time that still is today, or at least it was in the day that Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote his One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Receiving all of these letters and these stories, he starts to compile them and decides to compile and write the Gulag Archipelago. The Gulag Archipelago is, well, we might say it's his magnum opus. Although I will say this, Dostoevsky did not see it that way. In fact, from the very beginning of his life as a writer, he always saw it as his ultimate goal to write a history of the Russian Revolution, much in line with Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. And so he does, and it's called The Red Wheel. The Red Wheel is a fictional yet historical text about the Russian Revolution. Very, very long book. To read that would be more than the scope of even a class like this. So that is really Solzhenitsyn's magnum opus. He spent 54 years of his life working on the Red Wheel. Okay, I want to delve into now the readings for today. There's so many different ways we could have started this class, but I guess I thought, well, as I've read through the Gulag Archipelago several times, in fact, I've read all of these books several times, and as I was reading through this the second time, the Gulag Archipelago, something stood out to me, and I thought, this would be a wonderful way to begin this class on Alexander Solzhenitsyn. The Czechs as a Nation, an ethnographical essay by Fan Fanich. Okay, so it's sarcasm, of course. Solzhenitsyn writes this, but he writes this particular chapter as though he is an anthropologist stumbling upon a primitive, savage nation. And he is looking at this population of Czechs. And Czechs is the word that Solzhenitsyn uses to describe prisoners of the Gulag system. It's not just what Solzhenitsyn uses, it's the very word that they use. And he even speaks to how this originates on page 506. He talks about how eventually it came about that they would call the prisoners of the Gulag system Czechs. So you can read that in 506. Anyway, I think it's a wonderful thing because I think for most of us, when we are first approaching this text of the Gulag Archipelago, it can be such an insurmountable thing. And we can look at it and say, on the one hand, we want to know as much as we can, but on the other hand, we're like, can you just give me a basic summary? Well, this is a 33-page chapter that can really give you a very basic summary of what the Gulag system was like and the psychology, personality of a Czech. Okay, so let's speak to that. First of all, we have to realize, and we'll talk more about this as we go through the class, the history of it, but the history of the Soviet Union and the history of communism in the Soviet Union is inextricably attached to and connected with the establishment of concentration camps for those who disagree with the one-party system. So the definition of a totalitarian regime that Anne Applebaum speaks to in her text, The Gulag History, she uses the definition from the totalitarian dictator Mussolini in Italy, who essentially says that a totalitarian dictatorship or a totalitarian government controls every aspect of the citizens' lives. It doesn't just control Their external, it controls their internal. It controls their mindset, it controls their thoughts, it controls what they do, it controls who they are and what vocation in life they follow and who they marry and how many kids they have and what their kids do. It controls everything about the person. That's what a totalitarian dictatorship is. And even though it's Mussolini who comes up with the definition of a totalitarian dictatorship, it is the Soviet Union under the Bolsheviks that establish the first real totalitarian government. A government that is bent on controlling every aspect of a person's life. So this totalitarian dictatorship, this totalitarian regime that Lenin and the Bolsheviks establish, it's a one-party system. Only the Bolsheviks are in power. There's only the Bolshevik party that is in control. No one else is allowed. And anybody who disagrees with them is subject to being considered an anti-communist. They're considered to be against the party, and they may even be considered to be political, not only dissidents, but undermining the rule of law, and thus subject to arrest. So really what we're looking at is, in this class, in what we're considering by our read of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, we're really considering the nature of the Gulag system and concentration camp system that is itself a feature of the 20th century, as you know. The Gulag concentration camp system arises first in the Boer War, that takes place in South Africa. The British lock up the Boers in concentration camps, and it's really the first place that we see in history the use of and recourse to a concentration camp. Before Nazi Germany, we have the concentration camps of the Soviet Union that become known as gulags. These concentration camps of the Soviet Union are different than the concentration camps of the Nazis because they aren't meant for genocide, but they're meant for work. They want to essentially move anybody who is a political offender to work. Millions of people over the decades, the first several decades of the Soviet Union, and really even until the 80s, go through experience of this Gulag system. Principally, what must be said, though, is that many of these people are innocent. They're not guilty of any crime other than political dissidence. And they haven't really been convicted of any crime except political dissidence. Okay, so I'm going to just go through this a little bit. First thing we have to realize is that this is somewhat obviously satirical. So the concept of looking at the Zaks as though they are a particular animal or seeing them as a unique feature in the world is obviously to look at them and say, for example, that they are badgers or that they are bears. It's to truly objectify them from a naturalistic anthropological perspective. He talks about the walk that they get, how they develop a stoop, and then their head goes down. And I think some very interesting things that they point out is that they may look as though they're going to be compliant, but in fact, do not be fooled, Solzhenitsyn says. They're not compliant. In fact, One of the things he speaks as though there would have been a long 2-volume dissertation written about the Zeks. It says that they are lazy, greedy, and sly. But in fact, is that really how we might describe the Zek? Well, maybe not that, but in fact, the convict, on the other hand, we might say is rowdy, crafty, and transparent. But they deceive, and deception is one of the ways in which the Zek is able to make it through this experience. So you have to realize that a Zek living in a gulag doesn't have a lot of food. They don't have a lot of water. They have terrible places to sleep. The work output is absolutely outrageous and beyond reasonable. And so what attitude are they called to take, or what do they take in terms of their attitude? Well, they have an attitude of work loves fools, is what Solzhenitsyn says on the bottom of page 510. So what they try to do is to stretch the rubber, which is to say that they just pretend like they're working. They don't really work, they just pretend like they're working. And if the boss comes around and criticizes them and tells them to get to work, then to be sure, they're going to act as though they're going to work, but they don't ever really work. You can't, as a Zek, say, I won't work, I won't go out to work. To say you won't go out to work comes with punishment. And so you can't be overtly against the work. But in a passive-aggressive way, very passively, you could say, yes, I'll go to work. And then when you get to work, you don't do the work. Why is that important? Solzhenitsyn says it's not only that they hate work, but it's a method of survival, because the one who works the hardest is the one who dies the soonest. So he has a number of different Russian sayings here. The one who pulls is the one they urge on. He speaks a number of times about how they may try to incentivize work by giving extra rations, but at the end of the day, the amount of work that a Zek will put in order to earn the rations doesn't justify itself, because the rations that they've earned don't make up for the calories that they've lost. So there's a serious battle that's going on within the individual, and the battle is against work. They don't want to work too hard, because to work too hard is to burn too many calories, which ultimately results in death. A number of times in this chapter, he compares this Zek life to the life of imprisoned prisoners during the imperial age, and he points out how different they were. First of all, the prisoners of the imperial age have actually committed crimes. Second of all, they weren't treated as poorly as they were being treated by Stalin and his compatriots. Okay, one of the things that he says is the greatest importance is food. So he talks about what that food consists of. And first of all, it's food that, as he points out, no one else would actually ever eat. This black bread is the most substantial food that the Zeks eat. The other food that they eat is what he calls gruel. It's a soup that has no fat, no vegetables. It's just kind of like a warm liquid that they consume. And after this soup and black bread, makorka is the most important thing. And makorka is it is homegrown tobacco. So makorka is something that they value, that is probably second only to the black bread and the gruel. Then he talks about sleep being probably the third most important thing in the life of a Zek. He says that they have the ability to sleep. They don't ever need any sleeping pills. They can sleep even while they march. They can sleep standing still. They can sleep in the march. They can sleep on their day off and sleep through the night. Because when they're sleeping, they're burning through the time that they're doing to get to the point of freedom. Okay, so I think just going through these chapters, he points out the importance of secretiveness. And I love this phrase that he says. It comes from a Russian proverb. He sees parallels in the Russian culture and the culture of the Zek. He says, this is on the bottom of page 518, if you have found something, shut up. And if you have lost something, shut up too. So I think this concept that what happens is that while you're in prison, you may find things that make your life easier, but you don't dare tell anybody about that. Because if you tell somebody else about that one thing that's made your life easier, that person's going to take advantage of that as well. If you find a place to take a nap, you're not going to tell your neighbor, the person you're living with or working with, about the place to take a nap, because that person will take that as well. If you find somebody to sew up your shirt or your jacket, you're not going to tell another person about that. So what the implication is that secrecy and mistrustfulness become the order of the day in the life of a Zek. He talks about this title of Son of Gulag. A son of Gulag believes himself impenetrable, and also that he, on the contrary, can see right through those all around him. And, as the phrase goes, 6 feet beneath them. A son of Gulag. They have the ability to see the future, but the view of the future is very narrow. Because for a Zek, they realize that at the end of the day, you can end up being sent by prisoner transport to another gulag. So they don't look too far to the future. They just see themselves as following fate. And we might call this fate, if we were a person of faith, we could call this providence, God's divine providence. But in this particular case, generally speaking, Zeks do not have belief in God. They tend to be atheistic. So what are some of the rules of the life of a Zek? He says that there are commands, Zek commands. And he says these Zeks, they're not only an atheistic people, but in general, nothing is sacred to them. So we're not talking about commandments as in the 10 Commandments. No, we're talking about commandments that help a Zek to survive the system. Do not squeal. Don't squeal. So you don't tell on other people. You don't lick the bowls. What does that mean? You don't lick the bowls. In other words, you don't descend to slops, something that they consider a swift and abrupt way to die. And you don't scavenge. You don't shove your nose in someone else's mess tin. Mind your own business is another way of putting that. My home is my castle. One composite commandment on page 520. Don't trust, don't fear, don't beg. So the national character of the Zek is cast like a piece of sculpture with sharp definition. They also seem, according to Solzhenitsyn, to have a spiritual equilibrium. Over the time in the Gulag system, the person starts to not get excited or to not get severely disappointed. They just develop a stable, indifferent state of mind, so to speak. And he talks about how there's an imaginary gate at the entrance of the archipelago, the Gulag system. It says, "Do not lose heart, and as you leave, do not be overjoyed." So it's kind of a warning. Do not lose heart. You can make it out of here. Follow these rules. You will make it out of here. Do not be overjoyed. As you leave, don't think that you can never come back. The Zek is always expecting it to be worse. Could be worse. So when they sit around and they think about how bad things are, or if things are really bad, they can always say to themselves, well, it could be worse. I may be starving here. I may not have anything to sleep in. I may not have any clothes, have frostbite, but it could be worse. I could have been shot or anything like that. So, okay, obviously I could go through this whole thing and talk about this, but there's several interesting things to me. He talks about the religion of the Zek. The religion of the Zek is trust in, hope in, and amnesty. The belief that at any turn there may be an amnesty, a freedom, that the Politburo will grant an amnesty to certain classes or groups of people. And it's a false hope, of course, because it's an amnesty, something that they always have hope that it will come, but that it never comes. Solzhenitsyn talks about his hope in an amnesty while he's in prison in the Butyrki. So anyway, but this concept, this hope that they will one day be let go. They love to share their story, to talk about how they got there. Strangely and interestingly, I'm curious to hear thoughts about this. Their secret thirst for justice. Their secret thirst for justice. They're always looking for an explanation. When you don't have an explanation and you're experiencing injustice and suffering, we seek a greater justice, a greater explanation for what we're going through sometimes. And that's perhaps the motivation there. He also talks about the Zeks, how they love and value humor. They always have a sense of humor. Maybe a cynical sense of humor, but there's always a sense of humor. And the sense of humor is something that really helps them to get by. The last several pages of the text talk about different words and how the Zek world relates to what Solzhenitsyn calls the cannibal community. So the cannibals are the thieves. In the prison system under Solzhenitsyn, under Stalin, you have the actual criminals, those who have actually committed crimes, that are arrested and sentenced to prison. These are also sometimes identified as the thieves. Solzhenitsyn will call them the thieves. Below the thieves are thieves who have sold out to the system, to the leaders of the prisons, and these are called the bitches. And the bitches essentially are stoolies. They will tell, and they will essentially serve, but they get rewarded for their service, for what they do. But they're earn a slightly higher place in the prison system in relationship to the thieves and in relationship to the politicals. The vast majority of the population in the Gulag system, the prison system during the Soviet Union, is politicals. Those who have violated the Article 58, which we'll talk about next time. In fact, it's in the readings. Solzhenitsyn will lay out all the different possible violations of Article 58, political violations, the KRs. So anyway, that's enough for today. 50 minutes of lecturing and speaking. I'll do one more of these recordings as I look through the readings and have a little bit of a discussion, and then we will meet in person. I hope you enjoy the video on the Gulag Archipelago. It really helps us to put into context the impact that the Gulag Archipelago had when it first came out. Okay, see you next time.